Welcome back to Performance Process. My name is Ronan and I will be your host for this episode as per usual. Today we're getting into aero testing, but not quite in the same way as we've done on countless occasions before. Aero testing until now has typically just given us a number. A wind tunnel, for example, gives us total drag, a single number representing the sum of all the forces acting on the object and from which we can calculate a CDA. We know how much drag there is, but not where it's coming from or why. Until now, perhaps. Dan Bigham and the Red Bull Bora Hansgrohe performance team have just become the first team to use Particle Image Velocimetry, PIV, a laser-based imaging technique that visualizes airflow in 3D to map the wake behind a rider. It's a method listeners to this podcast will have heard the CyclingSpy get all giddy about earlier this year, and potentially a major leap in aerodynamic R&D, giving Bigham and Red Bull full field data for the first time. That's something we're about to get into. In short, right now we know how much drag there is. With PIV, we can see where and why it's happening. When we know why, we might find entirely new directions to tackle it. So, today we're going to talk to Dan about what this means for cycling aerodynamics, why it matters, what they learned, and whether this kind of testing could change how every team approaches performance development in future. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome back, I should say. Yeah, it's your second appearance, isn't it?
Yeah, more than second. Third, fourth, I don't know. You reckon second?
If we're counting cycling tips days, we could be up at 4 or 5 at this point, yeah.
Might even say 6 or 7.
Oh, he's spoiled the punchline there. We were going to sneak him in, but it wouldn't have been right to have this episode without the spy involved. So we've finally got all three of us in the one place on the one podcast at the one time, just to fuel the conspiracy theories some more. Welcome to the show, also, Spy.
Thanks for having me again.
You would think that the fact that all three of us are talking to each other, that would confirm that the spy is neither Dan nor myself. But somehow it will only just add to the conspiracy theories.
Hey, voice changes are fantastic.
Dan, you were getting back to the serious matter at hand here, PIV. You had a day in Catesby Tunnel recently, in which you did this PIV testing. You were pretty giddy after it, and you described it as one of the coolest moments of your career. It kind of also looked like one of the darkest moments of your career, if I'm honest. Maybe kick us off just by explaining what is PIV and what did that testing look like?
I mean, you could have been there had you managed to clear a calendar out. But it was a bit of a last-minute request to try and get you along. So sorry you missed out seeing it in the flesh. But so PIV, which is an acronym of Particle Image Velocimetry, or Velocimetry, depending how you pronounce it. So the words actually kind of explain what it is quite nicely. So you have particles, in this case, helium-filled soap bubbles. So they're quite small. They're about 0.3 millimeters in diameter, and literally hundreds of thousands of them. So they're neutrally buoyant because they're filled with helium. And image, the next word, that's basically we're using cameras, in this case, 8 high-speed cameras, all at different perspectives that help us in a few ways that we'll come on to explain. And then velocimetry, that is effectively we're trying to put numbers on velocities. So we're trying to calculate the velocities of these particles in 3D space. So why does that help us and how does it work? So the problem with aerodynamic testing in pretty much every environment other than CFD, where it sits in the computer, is you pretty much get an answer of it being less draggy or more draggy and by how much. And that's it. You don't really learn much more, except in a few scenarios, as to the why. And the why is pretty important. You can have theories and hypotheses as to why things may be occurring, but without actually rock solid data to say one way or another, you're literally guessing. And yeah, you can have an informed guess, but it is nonetheless a guess. Whereas PIV is literally measuring the aerodynamic flow around the object that you're putting through this laser beam sheet. And you can therefore see how these bubbles are flowing around you. They're not exactly like air, but they're not dissimilar to air in that they behave very similarly. They have low response to flow, so they flow in a very similar way. So therefore, you can look at how they flow around the body and then into the wake. You can look at, obviously, firstly and foremostly, the velocities, so the directions and the magnitudes of those velocities. And then by extension, you can start to calculate other things around the vortex locations, their trajectories. So you can calculate a thing called Q criterion, which is really interesting when you're trying to look at and assess vortices. You can look at the pressure in the wake, how big it is, how tall it is, its geometry, and basically just understand air and how it's flowing in the real world, which without this has never really been done. It's been the reserve of CFD. So the actual test itself, what did that look like? So PIV pretty much has been the reserve of Formula One, high-level motorsport, high-level automotive, purely due to the complexity and the cost. It's not a cheap thing. The laser beam itself is hundreds of thousands of euros alone. It's a pretty powerful laser beam. It's a class 4 laser, so the kind that can blind you instantly and do a lot of damage. So there's a lot of protective steps you have to take, including, in my case, riding with some big goggles in my helmet, which was quite the look. The same with everybody that had to go into the tunnel, because literally one little reflection of that laser beam in the wrong direction and that's it, you're blind, wow. Which is pretty scary thought at the same time. So making sure that your eyes are well protected is step one. But the actual setup for us, we use Catesby because we're actually wanting to ride the bike. But it all started off really in wind tunnels, where you would have a static camera or multiple cameras, depending on how complex you're trying to measure. You'd have a laser sheet or a laser beam. So you'd either have it in a very thin, sort of, let's say, few millimeters wide, all the way up to maybe like 20 centimeters. So you get a box, and then you would seed the entire wind tunnel full of these helium-filled soap bubbles, and basically use a laser beam to illuminate the bubbles, a camera to track them, and then do some maths. Whereas we want to do it in the real world, and so do many other teams, which is why LaVision were based at Catesby. They did a sort of month-long camp, you could probably call it, based at Catesby. Wouldn't tell me. Oh, sorry. Yeah, LaVision are the company behind the PIV. So they are, I guess, world leaders. In fact, I'm pretty sure they're world leaders in imaging techniques, not just in this environment. They do loads of other absolutely crazy things, looking at even like flow within like internal combustion engines. So what's happening inside an engine, they can actually measure that, which is a crazy thought from an engineering perspective, if nothing else. But anyway, they lead the way in PIV measurement as well. So they set themselves in Catesby and had plenty of other customers, high-level motorsport and automotive customers. They wouldn't tell me even who they were, that kind of level. It's very secretive. We're obviously a bit more open to talking about the interesting things we get up to. So they were there for a month, and we accessed just a single day in the tunnel. And what they do is they have a hole in the side of the tunnel where they set up their computer, their laser beam, and they build a big structural rig around the tunnel itself. So the tunnel is about 8.5 meters tall and wide. And then on that sort of gantry, they have 8 different high-speed cameras. And they have, I think it was in total 6 or 8 seeding towers. So these are creating and seeding the helium bubbles into the air itself. So in simple terms, the rider has to ride through the laser sheet, and the laser illuminates the bubbles. The cameras track every single bubble in real time, which is pretty awesome. And throughout all those different frames, you can start to calculate the velocity of each of those bubbles, predominantly in plane, but also, across the plane, but you can also get an in-plane measurement. So it's called 2D, 3C. So it has 2-dimensional, but you get 3 components of velocity out of it. And that's at a given time interval. So then we're riding through at constant speed. I was always aiming for a certain speed, certain position. That's very important. You have to be on the same line, in the same position, at the same velocity every single time. And you ride through the beam while you're riding in the dark with some crazy goggles. So it's even more dark than Catesby normally is. Not this, it's particularly dark, but there's intermittent lighting through the length of the tunnel. But then suddenly you're having to put these goggles on that limit the light. I mean, I can't even see the laser beam itself with these goggles on. And then the section immediately after the sheet, we have to have pitch black, because we don't want any reflections. We don't want any of the light to be picked up by the cameras. We want the cameras to purely measure the light that's reflected by those helium-filled soap bubbles. That includes me and the bike. So I had to spray everything in black chalk paint. So all of the bike, the wheel, helmet, my clothing, everything was pitch black, which was quite the look. And the chalk spray, as much as it's fairly durable, it still rubs off on everything. And it looked like I'd literally been down a mine for a few hours. And it kind of felt like that, to be honest, as well. Because, again, the dangerousness of the laser, we're having to keep it to an absolute minimum of people in the tunnel. So there was 2 people from LaVision who were running the session, and then myself, and I'm literally going up and down the tunnel. So we're having to do 20 passes through the laser sheet per setup. So if you change your position, you change your clothing, you change your speed, every single one of them, we need 20 passes. And that's kind of a minimum, really. If you're in the world of automotive, you're looking at 40, 50, 60. And that just comes down to getting statistical confidence in the data that you're measuring. So if you were doing this in a wind tunnel, you can just sample continuously because the air keeps flowing and your camera and your laser beam is static. Whereas because the laser beam is static and the bubbles are static, we're having to ride through that. So we only get really a single snapshot. So we're having to repeat that multiple times over to then get enough data to be confident in calculating all these different metrics. So it becomes quite a long day when you think about doing different positions. So we also, actually one point to add to this is we're doing static leg position, which is for two reasons really. And we'll get onto this, we want to use it to correlate our CFD, and CFD is done with static leg positions currently and probably for the foreseeable future. And also when you're riding through, you want to always be in the exact same position. Now, if I'm pedaling, I can't be very sure of exactly what leg position I'm at when I'm riding through that beam. And the flow structure is incredibly different as you're pedaling. If you just look at aero drag alone, there's not an insignificant amount of variation, sort of 5, 10, 15, even 20% on some people of total drag variation throughout a pedal cycle. So if you're at any random point in that each time through, then that's an inconsistency as we're calculating the drag. So we're doing different leg positions, vertical and horizontal legs. We did some different speeds, different skin suits. So just adding out, and each one needs 20 passes. So it becomes well over 100 passes through this laser sheet. And each time we're generating gigabytes of data because every single bubble, of which there's tens, if not hundreds of thousands, is being tracked by a camera. And that's being calculated for the velocity in plane and out of plane. And then if we go slow enough as well, we can track them between frames and you start to get a full profile, which is pretty awesome. As you go faster and faster, which at our higher end speeds we couldn't do, we have to then segment them out into distinct planes, and you can build kind of what is pseudo 3D, but is not technically 3D in the traditional sense, which is tomographic PIV, which is so much more complex. You need lots more cameras, a lot more computing power. So yeah, it's pretty much a process of that, of run, measure, calculate, repeat times 20, change something, repeat again for an entire day.
Fascinating. Spy, we have you on the show today to kind of sort of ask the technical questions that I wouldn't even think to ask. So for I guess, first of all, is what you're hearing Dan explain here, what you were thinking when you mentioned PIV back in March or April time on that initial episode that we did.
I mean, yeah, that's pretty much what I thought. By talking about PIV earlier, I've got some questions about PIV in the winter afterwards, but I guess the first one, going to the repeatability or doing the 20 repeats. How were you finding the chalk spray, or did you think the chalk spray was going to have any interference on the fabric side of things, the textures on the bike frame, because it's going to leave some sort of residue, isn't it? And then also in terms of repeatability, in terms of reflections, if you're changing suit or if the chalk spray is particles of chalk are falling off the bike as you're riding, are you having to reapply? Are you trying to be careful as to how you reapply? Did you notice a difference? Or
so that's one to really dig into in a bit more. I think firstly and foremostly, you can't do the test without doing that. So you have to accept it's a necessary evil. To what degree it's sensitive to that, I don't have a good number to put on it. We were smart about how we did it with the skin suit. I won't give too much away there. So I don't think it had an impact per se. And actually, given the effort required to get it off afterwards, like jet washing, significant cleaners, brushing, etc., to get it off the frame, etc., it wasn't. I don't feel like anyway it was flying off as we're riding down the tunnel. So I have a good degree of confidence, but it's just one of those things that you don't, or at least can't easily put a number on without doing back-to-back tests. Maybe next time we're in the tunnel. I mean, part of this process, we did full validation of all of our different methods within that. So repeated everything we tested in PIV. We did actually just testing in Catesby, what were the drag values. Same in the wind tunnel, and same in the track. We'll do the same in CFD, or currently are in many different ways. So it'll be quite a lovely data set to get correlation, hopefully, across all of our different test platforms.
how long do you think that correlation exercise is going to take?
There's no easing into this. There's no let's big this up and then ask the ones. It's boom, straight on.
Yeah, I literally feel like I'm going to have to block my calendar out for a good amount of time to crunch it, because it's not something that is commonplace. Even if we look in Formula One, how they use it, it's not that they have this nice workflow of run PIV, press a couple of buttons, and here's your answer on how to improve your CFD and how to get it all correlated nicely. It's very much a manual process, and with big data sets as well. So there is a large degree of manual processing, and then also just subjective opinion, really, of looking at, okay, is this wake exactly the same as that one? And then how could we actually do a statistical analysis to compare those two wakes, and then writing some Python or MATLAB scripts to do that. So it's going to take some time. And I know, Ronan, you want to ask later on a bit about the results, and it's not one that I can sit here and be like, yeah, here's everything we learned. Not that I would, even if we'd got to that point, but it's going to be months and months of really understanding. And then when you have an answer, you then want to try and refine your tools. So that's sort of the next step. You then have to go through the refinement. Okay, we didn't get good correlation in certain areas. What functions can we change within our CFD? Like, for example, do we go RANS to DES? And then in DES as well, how do we play around with that blending between RANS and LES models? We're getting some real big acronyms here. Hopefully we'll try to explain them.
We're not talking about DESFIT here. Do you want to maybe just ever so, as soon as you've mentioned them, give the audience a brief explanation of what we are talking about there?
So really, when we step back from this, the key thing we're after is getting correlation and validation of all of our different test methods across different, well, pretty clearly from CFD through wind tunnel, Catesby, indoor tracks, outdoor tracks, field tests. And hopefully the end goal is when you go to a race, you are faster. But obviously, that's where we need performance to exist. It doesn't matter if performance exists in any of those other environments if it doesn't make its way to the race. So that's the key thing. But all of those tools need to work in harmony with each other and be used for different reasons. And those reasons could be as simple as a rider can't get to a certain wind tunnel because of their training schedule. So we have to test them in another environment, which maybe isn't optimal for what we're trying to test, but we need to understand what the caveats are, the limitations are, and also how we transfer the results from that to the then end goal of going to a race. The big thing with CFD is literally maths in a computer. And that's great, but maths needs to be validated. And pretty much most CFD validation comes from just looking at, do you predict the drag values or side force values or lift values in the correct way? And the change, both the change and the magnitude of that change. And that's pretty much about it. Whereas PIV takes that not just one step further, but multiple steps further of then actually looking at, you're predicting the velocity vectors, the whole flow field, so the pressure field, and all the vorticities. So where are the vortices? How powerful are they? Etc. And you can then correlate those two. And when they're wrong, you can then understand a lot more about why they might be wrong and how you need to fine tune those CFD models to ensure they are well correlated and valid. Because without that, you're literally shooting in the dark with CFD. And considering a cyclist is a bluff body, it's pretty crap at bluff body CFD. We're having to have models that look at how boundary layers transition and how wakes are modeled, especially within RANS. So RANS is Reynolds averaged Navier-Stokes equations. They're basically the underpinning equations for airflow, and they simplify them. That basically then adds in a simpler model that models the turbulent wake behind a bluff body where we get separation. Now you can get more and more advanced all the way through to direct numerical simulation, which is literally solving every single particle around a rider or an object. I say a rider because we'd never actually be able to do it around a rider because that would take hundreds of years on the biggest supercomputer we have in the world. So you could maybe do that on an airfoil shape in a computer. That's probably as extreme you'd get with direct numerical simulation, but you can start to sort of pare that back, and you can start to then look at other models. So large eddy simulations, which then actually look at simulating the turbulent wake. You can blend LES, large eddy simulation, with RANS, and you get a thing called DES or DDES, depending which ones you go down. And DES is detached eddy simulation, or delayed detached eddy simulation for DDES. And you're basically then moving between a hybrid of two different CFD models. So in areas where RANS works well, so positive pressure gradients, no separation, you use RANS because it's quick, efficient, cheap, because the compute is low. And then in areas where you're getting separated turbulent wakes, you blend over to your LES model, and then you're actually modeling the wake structures throughout time rather than averaging them out, which is more true to reality, and therefore in theory should give us more realistic results and therefore hopefully better correlation. But also those things can take fine tuning, looking at your wall functions. So how does the actual, we call them walls, but a rider's skin suit, for example, would be a wall. Well, what function do you put on that? Most of RAN's validation and correlation has historically been done on automotive and motorsport, where you have relatively consistent surface finishes that are smooth. We have a textile finish. That's not very well correlated, shall we say. There is some papers stepping in that direction, but it's definitely not perfect yet. And it's a massive area of performance or potential performance benefit if we can validate that, which is where PIV is one step in that direction.
I mean, you can see with the textures on suits and stuff, extremely Reynolds sensitive, high speed sensitive. We know that. which means you can see the problem in the Reynolds average bit if you're trying to model something that is very Reynolds sensitive. So you've explained sort of the how and a bit of the why. I guess the question that I've got is, you're saying it's going to take a while to get the results out of it. How did you convince the team to let you spend this amount of money on something that is quite slow to get results out of, and sort of kind of a question up in the air if you get results out of it? How did that go, those conversations?
Mostly, we got a really good arrangement between ourselves at Red Bull, Bora, Hansgrohe and Specialized, along with LaVision and Catesby, that a nice reciprocal arrangement, should we say. So LaVision now have a data set that they can personally use within their company to explain a bit more about how their system works, how it can benefit other people. Because to go back to what I originally said, that these most modern automotive firms, they're very protective, with good reason, as to what they're doing. Not that we shouldn't be, but we're kind of first through the door, and if it gives us benefit and gives them benefit, then we're in a more favourable relationship there, shall we say.
I've heard some of the numbers involved here. You could be looking at, what, £30,000 per day? Is that enough?
It's about that.
So this is not something you're going to be doing every other week, which kind of gets me to the question, like, is a one-off day like this enough, or how many times are you going to have to go back to start seeing any sort of value coming from what you have been able to achieve so far?
I think the answer in that is in the analysis itself, that I'm sure we'll get to the end of it and go, there's so many more questions that we need to go and ask to get answers to. And obviously there's some pretty high level riders within the team that would love to understand a lot more of the flow strictures around them and really fine tune our tools to work on our best guys. Like Leaf Fits, like Rocco Benepol, like Roglic, like Pellizzari. I think there's plenty you could name. And I think we would in the future look to do that. I think firstly, we just need to go and complete this entire process before we can then go, actually, this is incredibly good value. And we definitely should do it with all of our guys. But again, that confidence first is probably the key thing. Also, the different things that I wanted to test, it was just challenging. The time of year we did it meant that, well, two things really. One, we couldn't get riders in. It was between the worlds, the Europeans, Lombardia. Obviously, they're trying to win these big bike races, and dragging them over to Catesby to ride up and down a dark tunnel for a good few hours, or most of the day, maybe wasn't best use of their time. And we also needed to make sure the rider was repeatable. And I've done a lot of testing, and I'm very aware of the things we needed to do. So therefore, it made most sense that I was that test rider. And it's easy for me to go to different locations to do that entire correlation study for different velodromes, to wind tunnels, to Catesby, to running the CFD and getting the scans done. It's a lot easier when it's me doing the testing and me doing the processing. It all kind of sits harmoniously. But in the future, I hope, and I believe we probably will do more tests, but it's also not going to be something that you're doing every few weeks.
Being part of the Red Bull family, surely there's some relationship with the Formula One team, which has PIV in their wind tunnel. Surely there's an incentive there for them. Develop their tools, their resources outside the F1 cost cap by doing it with the cycling team. Because PIV, as you say, is a manual process for the F1 team. So if they can, surely they have a financial vested competitive interest in other areas of their business to develop an API. So how come this was done in person with all the challenges, like you say, having to do 20 repeats versus doing that wind tunnel or just constant capture? Or did you have those discussions?
I have, and I'll come on to that in a second. I think firstly as well, testing in the real world is probably the right way to start. There's an argument to be had for both, I would say. You could do it in a wind tunnel and correlate to a wind tunnel, but arguably you should also be setting your CFD setup as the wind tunnel and how that works, because you want correlation to the environment in which you tested. So how we run the CFD is basically within Catesby Tunnel as well. So all of the constraints of that, not that we're necessarily interacting with the walls, like that is so big in comparison to the size of our wake, but it makes sense still to do that. Whereas in the wind tunnel, there's other things at play, and obviously the reference planes and how the boundary layers build up versus not having that at all within Catesby. So I think it was a better environment for correlation, at least in the first instance. Now, I had a meeting just last week with Daniel Smith, who's the lead aerodynamicist at Red Bull Advanced Technologies, literally about this exact topic and CFD, and talking about how we move that forward. Obviously, they're working on their next wind tunnel. I say working on, it's literally getting built at the moment, and it potentially is accessible in the future. It's not, in the world of cycle sport, not great value, even within the house of Red Bull, because they've invested so much in it, and the technology within there, it still puts it at a level internally that it's still quite expensive to do. And is that necessary? I think it's a discussion that will be had for sure. And what should we do? But it's still going to take a few people convincing that's the right thing to go in that direction.
Yeah, I guess the thing on my mind is it might be the best way to get that pedaling rider in to look at it. If you're essentially limited by the frame in getting it, you won't be able to get a full pedal rev in that frame at 60k an hour. So I guess that's sort of where I'm thinking is sort of watt per kilo more, which might be potentially a couple of years away at least.
That kind of gets to the question I was following up with you, Dan, on Friday. It was just like, what does this actually, maybe it's better to ask a question, what does this look like when you have the data coming out? Is it like Roadrunner running through a cardboard wall and then there's a cutout of him? Is that what you see? Or are you just seeing something that would be unrecognizable as a rider to most people?
So for everyone listening, I would say go on Red Bull Bora Hansgrohe's social media channels. By this point, hopefully there's a video up showing a bit more about what you see. But if I try and describe it in the steps in which you gain information. So first and foremost, when I'm riding, I can't see the laser beams or the bubbles. For me, it's just riding down a dark tunnel. That's because of the goggles. So they're literally stopping that laser beam of that wavelength from reaching my eyes, so I don't go blind. But then the cameras themselves... Yeah, exactly. I can't look afterwards. The cameras themselves, they're just grayscale. So they're just picking up the laser sheet illuminating a single or all of the helium bubbles and then tracking them. So those then get converted into virtual particles that then have at each time frame a XY coordinate, and then from the additional planes you get the sort of Z component, it's the in-plane component of velocity. So you end up with lots and lots and lots of particles, and you know their velocity and you know their direction. So that then gets plotted in basically pressure and velocity vector plot. So if you think about it in a single plane, you're looking at the back of the rider, and you can see every section as you move backward from the rider all the way through the wake, which is many, many meters long. You can see the pressure at any given point, and you can see the velocity magnitude, so like the size of the velocity. So it's basically like a little arrow on every single particle. So the direction in which it's going and how big it is. So that gives you an idea of the flow and how it's moving. And then from that calculated value, you can then calculate vorticity. So that's basically how much the air is swirling in a very tight controlled way, and whereabouts that occurs, and the trajectory, i.e. the direction of that vortex or multiple vortexes within cycling. So they're kind of the main things you would go to look at when you start to do that comparison with your CFD. You'd be looking at, is the size of the pressure wake the same, and is the sort of general shape of it the same, the height, the width? The velocity vectors, are they as you've also modeled in CFD? And if they're different, where are they and why? And then the vortexes, where are the cores? What at any given point in that plane, and what is their trajectory? How strong are they in comparison to what you get in CFD? And how do they vary as speed changes, skin suits, position, etc.? I mean, just to continue that point in general, like the actual visualization of this data is challenging, which is where LaVision really lead the way. They have their software called, I think it's called LaViz, quite an original name, but it just visualizes all of this in a way that is understanding or easy to understand. So you put in, we call it an STL model, but it's basically a 3D scan of the rider and the bike. You put that in, so you get that context of where and what, and you can see where things are moving from and to. And that just enables you to understand and really interpret that data set. You can export it and then throw it into MATLAB, Python, any number of different data viewers to then do your own analysis if you want to. And you can do the exact same thing in CFD, and then you can pull the two together and then start to look statistically from a maths perspective. If you put the bike and CFDs in the same place as it was in PIV, how does everything compare?
And I think that's where for me, it's starting to hit home what you're looking to do here. But it also gets me back to the Red Bull F1 question that Spy just asked, because that team, with all the resources they have, and let's face it, somewhat easier project to work on in terms of aerodynamics and Reynolds numbers, but they have still had their correlation issues over the last 36 months or so. And it kind of gets me to like wondering if a team that well resourced with this option in-house, what confidence do you have that we'll get there in cycling?
I think their correlation issues largely stem from the fact that they're much more complex in the world of aerodynamics than what we're trying to do, and how hard they're working the aerodynamic flows. We're literally looking at drag, give or take. whereas they're lift and drag, and there's a lot of interactions with boundary layers. There's a lot of factors that don't necessarily scale in the way you would expect, even down to things like tire squash. So you have tire jets that come out from each tire, basically big vortices that are very, very powerful, and how you control them is very important to how your diffuser works. It's actually the area I used to work on back in Mercedes for a little bit of time. So I did a small amount of work in that area to understand a bit more about what's going on. But if you don't model that well in CFD and your wind tunnel doesn't accurately replicate real world, because they're also doing scale testing, then you end up in a pretty dangerous position of not having good correlation. And I've heard loads of stories of finding so much in the wind tunnel, and then they bring the full scale car in and do a repeat on there, and they find like 10% of what they thought they'd found. And that whole signal to noise as well is pretty bad in sort of the realms of what they're looking for versus the amount of force that they're measuring. So it's why they struggle, I believe anyway, with their correlation, whereas with us, it's a bit more rough and ready. There's absolutely the textile issue, and I don't think we can get away from that, but I think moving in that direction of at least trying to do some correlation, because at the moment it's next to zero. So there's absolutely going to be some big steps forward we can make. Getting perfect correlation between all these different test environments, I think we'll struggle for some time yet. There's other things at play beyond just, selecting the right CFD model. Getting correlation between Catesby, a wind tunnel, a velodrome test, and a race in itself is challenging. And there's things that I'm not going to mention here because I think that's part of the secret, but understanding all the different things that are going on and why you would get a different answer in a wind tunnel versus a track for doing the exact same test, or going from a track to a field test, and what's happening that means you would get a different answer. And that's not wrong. It's not that your sensors are incorrect. That's just the physics, and making sure your physics are well and correct. Because if your physics are good and proper and all your tools work properly, then you are in a relatively good position. Which, to go back to the Red Bull F1 side, we have a big project with Red Bull Advanced Technologies on our simulation. And our simulation model is literally taking all of our understanding of aerodynamics, of roaring resistance, of drivetrain, of physiology as well, because you have to have a physiology model to decide how much power you want to put in at a given moment, and basically puts them all into a computer model. You press go and it tells you the best setup and how to ride the course, which is really powerful. But if your models are wrong, then your output is wrong. And they're all going to be wrong to some degree or another, but you've really got to understand them. And the aerodynamics one is the challenging one, but that's where we can use their knowledge. And we are using their knowledge to make sure that we plug those holes in understanding. And it takes time, it takes resource, it takes effort. But also from my side, I find that really quite enjoyable, because you speak with these people and they're like, yeah, I see what you've done there, but actually you're ignoring this, this, and this, and that's actually quite a big assumption. And you probably want to go and do a bit of time and spend a bit of time and money and effort on solving that, or at least coming back with some reasonable data we can work with. Which is, on one hand, is a bit frustrating. You're like, yeah, you're right, okay, back to the drawing board on that one. But it's also incredibly powerful for the future when we're going to be in hopefully a very good place.
I guess when the Spy first brought up PIV in the podcast, I got excited when I heard you then, Dan, talking about you were going to be doing this. And I was thinking, oh, it's going to unlock all these new directions that we can take optimizations, and you're going to have barge boards on the rider's hips and all sorts of stuff. And actually what transpires is that you cycled down a dark tunnel risking becoming blind to correlate your CFD. Is that correlation aspect as exciting to you as the idea of, fancy turbulators and stuff that I was thinking of would be? Or, is this just an intermediate step, do you think?
It's kind of one and the same, but yeah, maybe it is an intermediate step. So if you get the correlation right, then your CFD is the location in which you do this testing. It's not financially sensible or resource wise to be using this as a development tool. It really is a correlation tool, I believe. It obviously gives you a wealth of understanding of the why, and you are looking underneath the hood and you're seeing air move. But to use that to just do testing is pretty expensive and probably not necessary if you get the good correlation that you hope for from the CFD. And I believe that's how it's used in Formula One. It's really just checking, like, do your models align? And if they don't, why not and where? And it really helps to use it as a checking tool, an error finding tool, and then fine tuning tool. But it's not a test environment like you would think with CFD, where you're like, right, we're going to test all your different positions on here, because you're not going to easily pick out, say, like a 10 mil difference in stack height unless you're kicking off a load of separation earlier. So it really is more on the diagnostics than on the research.
I guess that is the exciting part of it, is that once you know your CFD is correlating, you can go all sorts of directions with your CFD.
Which is, I think, what I'm doing in pretty much all my work at the moment is firstly, checking our tools. Are they valid? And if we don't have them, having to sometimes build them up in certain areas. Like before I joined the team, there wasn't really an engineering department within Red Bull Bora Hansgrohe. We relied pretty much entirely on our partners who specialised predominantly on doing all this aero testing with us in the wind tunnel or on the track or elsewhere. So now we're having to build all those tools up, get them validated and correlated, but hopefully when that's all achieved, and we're closing in on it, and the same again with the simulation tool, because that's part of the exact same process, then you can go very quickly and very confidently in the direction you want without question, or not without questioning. You definitely should question along the way, but with a good degree of confidence that it's the right direction to go in. And when results come up that maybe are a bit abnormal or a bit different, you have a good idea as to why that might have been the case. And you can use different tools to go and probe and prod, rather than at the moment, it's like we understand we should do all these different things, but if you've not sort of connected them all up and you haven't trusted them or gained trust in them and got validation, then it's a bit of a guesswork. And you don't want to be in that situation where you're developing bikes and wheels and tires and skin suits and helmets and rider positions that doesn't correlate to race performance, which is everything that you've heard of in Formula One. It's really common, right? Oh, we found this in the wind tunnel, and then you put it on track and the performance wasn't there. Well, you've wasted a lot of resource. And if you'd got that correlation early on, then maybe that performance would have found its way to the track.
You're about 6 weeks on since you did this day in Catesby or so. Have you any insight yet? Do you have any results yet which suggest whether your current or previous CFD was correlating well or not?
I have some results. I could say it's logical. So it looks like you would expect it to look. There's nothing drastically wrong from it. There's a few little differences in the wake that you're like, okay, that's not quite what I remember seeing or expected. So the CFD is going on alongside that. So at Catesby did the 3D scans, then they're being run through all the different CFD options that we're looking at the moment. And then that becomes the bigger process of taking all that data and putting it all together and understanding it really. So it's not that I can sit here and tell you all the great, interesting insights because we don't have them yet. It is an ongoing process. And like the spy, I nearly gave his name away for a second. Like the spy said earlier on, it's a big project. It's no small undertaking really to process all of this, but it will give a wealth of understanding out the other side.
Yeah, because of course I'm only just thinking now as you're speaking, Dan, that you would have 3D scanned yourself in Catesby that day to then run CFD on that scan and then...
Yeah, exactly that. So scanning in different leg positions and different setups so that we've got all of that we can then go and run in CFD. And then, with Specialized, obviously, they've already got all the equipment CAD. So you basically throw it all together. You have a bike, you have me sitting on top, goggles included, and throw it into CFD in the simplest of terms. But there's so many different CFD packages, even online. If you go out and look now in just sort of commercial settings, there are a lot of online CFD solutions that, largely speaking, plug and play. You drop in a CAD file, an STL file, you pick your wind speeds, your yaw angles, you press go, and then sometime the next day you get an answer back. Now, how good the answer is up for debate, and that's really the crux of this whole thing, that you want to trust your CFD models. So making sure that you go with the right company, the right type of CFD, the right boundary conditions and setup, and then once you've run all of those different options and permutations that are of interest, you then can do your proper correlation and sit down and crunch the numbers.
Remco particularly is famous for doing lots of testing throughout the year. We've seen in his YouTube videos, he does lots of days on the velodrome, and historically. So he seems pretty keen for testing. What sort of is the plan with not Remco specifically, but getting riders in these situations, getting them tested, getting them kind of onto that asymptote of performance as quickly as possible with the equipment that you guys are using? Like, what does that rider test plan look like? And are you just throwing them in a wind tunnel for 2 weeks solid to see what happens? Or is there more of a structured plan so that it's kind of more outcome-led so you can use their time efficiently?
Yeah, efficient use of time. I think that's the key one. We often end up having discussions with coaches on, how do you achieve peak performance? Not most watts on a given race. You want to go as fast as you can. Now, obviously, in a Grand Tour, you only have one, maybe two time trials. I mean, if we look at the Tour next year, you've got a team time trial and what is barely a time trial. if that's a bit of a slight on ASO, but I could do with a flatter time trial. That would be nice. But the point being is you need to toe that line of how much time should you spend training and racing and how much time should you spend testing and what do those tests look like. So we really want to reduce concluding anything on riders that could be concluded elsewhere. And that's where that full breadth of tools help. So, for example, can we test things on me? Can we test things in a computer? Can we test things in another way that gives us the answer without having to need to bring Remco from his altitude camp down to a certain test environment? So even though he's keen to test, and we've just done a week over in California at Morgan Hill in the wind tunnel at Specialized. And that was great. Multiple, very long days in the tunnel and then also on the track just down the road. And he's a great tester and very repeatable, very open-minded, never moans that he's having to be in a wind tunnel. In fact, he has a great selection of music. So the good thing about Specialized, they've got a big speaker system in there. Don't discuss the impact on aerodynamics because I haven't even considered that. Maybe it changes some boundary layer acoustics. Who knows? But he was great. In fact, everybody that we took there was really, really open-minded to the process. And I think they saw the value in what we did there with Specialized, and having the wind tunnel literally next door to their retail bike fit studio is really powerful. And there's some really cool tech that we're working on there with retail and with Specialized that I think will come out in the near future. But being able to kind of have that trifecta between bike fit, wind tunnel, track testing was pretty awesome. Obviously, this is another layer that feeds into that. But it was a really useful time. But we don't want to be doing that all year long. It becomes such an onerous thing on riders. You want that consistency of training. You want that consistency at altitude, consistency of sleep, travel, nutrition, all the things that go into achieving peak performance. So it's a delicate balancing act. And this will hopefully anyway go some way to reducing that load so that we can conclude on some aspects of performance elsewhere, or when we do test them, we can come with much better darts to throw at the theoretical or the hypothetical dartboard of performance, because that's pretty much what you're doing with a rider. You have some degree of guesswork to it of, do we go up? Do we go down? Do we go in? Do we go out? Do we change stuff? Do we not? And if you can have a good idea of the right direction to go in, then you make better guesses and hopefully get more performance.
Talk to me a bit about that testing you did with Remco then. Like, you were in the tunnel in California, having just done this in Catesby, the PIV. Like, how much of you was like, feck, I just wish we'd already got the results from that so we know our CFD correlates so that we can just know which direction to go with Remco without a load of trial and error. And also, like, how confident are you that actually, while you might find correlation in the CFD based on the PIV runs that you did, does that transfer then to Remco? Like the assumptions carry across?
That's a big question. I'll tackle that one separately. So firstly, I accepted that I wouldn't have results very quickly. I knew that. I expected the amount of work, and basically it's probably going to be January really when I tackle it in earnest. We have a pretty long December camp. I'll be there for nearly 3 weeks, which is quite a scary thought. Most of my Christmas running gone. It's all the good Christmas markets. It means that I'm going to then, tackle this properly in January. There'll be a few things that I'm looking at before then, but it's absolutely a long-term project. My gut feeling, and it is an opinion nonetheless, is the first order gains will come from correlation around textile surfaces and the correct use of boundary conditions and the correct use of the right models, the right type of RANs, LES, hybrid, etc. However, that doesn't necessarily mean we'll get perfect correlation on everybody else after that. And we probably don't want to chase perfect correlation. You get an R squared of 1 between every measure of CFD and PIV with me, then we've probably just tuned our model to work perfectly on myself. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work perfectly on everybody else. So it's definitely one we need to be aware of. To that end, it makes sense that we need to bring other riders in to bring further confidence and further refinement. I hope that we make just a big step forward first, and that validates that investment for future tests. And I'm pretty sure Remco and Lipovitz, they're going to be keen to come and to get involved. And I mean, both of them have spoke about, obviously Lipo's already been to Catesby and he loved it as a test environment. We'll have him back there in a few weeks' time. I think just riding is such a nice thing in comparison to riding in a wind tunnel where you're on a glorified static trainer and it's a bit cold, a bit monotonous and boring, whereas this unique environment of Catesby Tunnel is quite entertaining in a sort of novel way. So I think Remco is also keen to follow suit there. And if we can throw a few bubbles and laser beams into it, then I'm sure we'd be very keen for that. And it just adds another layer to our validation and improvement of our tools. And hopefully, you unearth a few little gems that we didn't know about how Remco is so aero and how we can make it better.
That sort of feeds back to what we were discussing in that first part, Ronan. And it being like with the textile and the texture stuff being more physics-based as opposed to just correlation-based, like some of the CFD models that exist right now. They've gone with like a roughly correlation-based model into commercial CFD packages. I think they were plus or minus 4% in terms of the absolute drag, which is, I mean, especially at the pro ranks, especially when you're looking at someone as optimizers. Remco plus minus 4% is quite large. But Remco, and to me, this is just me stating my personal opinion. I'm not sure this is even necessarily a question. I think it's more interesting when you look at the Lipowitz and the Pelletsries in that quite limmy, skinny rider problem, as opposed to the very bloof bodies like the Remcos and the Roglics. Because historically, there's always been a gap between sort of guys built like Remco and the guys built like Julio. And that the skinny riders, for some reason, there's like disproportionate drag increase for someone of their size versus if you tweak their proportions ever so slightly. So I think I completely agree in that kind of slightly more physics-based with those tighter radius of curvature around the arms and stuff, particularly, that is going to be quite transformative for some of those pure climber types when they get to the flat TTs.
I always find that quite, one, interesting, but two, frustrating, that you can have someone who's smaller, for all else being equal, more draggy. Spy, I won't give too much away, but I'm sure you've...
Guys weighing 20 kilos more, I'm doing like watt per kilo more, and they've got 100 watts on me and less drag, and it's just...
I've seen some great T-shirts of fat is fast, and it's very true. I mean, it's one of the reasons we've seen this push towards like oversized radios, things down the front, just rounding out. Like one of the reasons, or potentially one of the reasons why. But like the Spy said then as well, like radius of curvature around relatively key areas. As your radius of curvature gets tighter, then your adverse pressure gradient is a lot more aggressive and you're more likely to get separation prematurely. So having nice, round, smooth, fat limbs is potentially an advantage, but it's the understanding of that. And that, therefore, how do you develop textiles that work in a way for those riders? And PIV is just one step. It will not give us the answer to that for sure. It's such a complex problem, textile CFD, and understanding of that, and that in a computational domain, it's, I mean, just when you drill down into what a textile is, lots of tiny little threads, basically cylinders, they're all interacting with each other. They're all generating turbulent wakes. They're all somewhat elastic and floating around and moving with the airflows. It's complex, and how you try and scale that up to some interaction with the boundary layer. It's a big old problem.
Exciting one though.
That sort of hints at an article you've promised us for a long time, Spy. We maybe won't give it away here, but any sign on that coming anytime soon?
It's on my to-do list. Hopefully as a Christmas present for Escape readers.
I mean, moving us on here, Dan, just to sort of wrap us up, because I know you have other meetings to get to today, but the one question remaining for me is, like, TU Delft have done their Ring of Fire thing previously in a tunnel with a mannequin. Is that something you looked at and thought, getting back to, we want to start with a real rider in a close to real world environment, or do you still see potential in bringing PIV into that sort of setting again for the work that you're doing?
It was actually the TU Delft presentation I saw back at the Science and Cycling Conference it was Brussels. So I want to say 2018. It was that where the Tour de France Grand Depart was that year?
It was 18 or 19, yeah. They did a team time trial and Turnison went into yellow, yeah. So
one of those two, and I saw their presentation on how they're using PIV around mannequins in the tunnel, and they presented the Ring of Fire concept, and they had this. It was pre-AI, so it was just like basically Microsoft Paint, but the Ring of Fire and a cyclist on a velodrome, and I was like, I need that in my life. And I think this was before I joined Denmark, but Denmark had a concerted effort with the cycling union to try and get that to happen. But TU Delft had either stopped doing the work with them, or the person doing their research had moved on, maybe onto the real world. So that didn't really happen. So it's been 6-7 years in the making that I've been keen to go down this path, but it's just taken this long for it to become not just feasible, but a sensible thing to do with like a genuine outcome. So back in the Denmark Cycle Union days, it was more out of potential just interest, really. Like this could unlock a lot of understanding, but we weren't using a plethora of different test methods. Our testing was 99.9% on the velodrome because we were track cyclists preparing for the Olympics. Whereas now it's absolutely brings true value to validation. So I think it's just the next step forward, and it's been nice to be at the frontier of that and pushing it.
Kind of getting into talking about the future here, then what else do you predict, or what else do you think this unlocks, or what's the next most exciting thing that this leads on to for you?
I mean, aside of everything we've already mentioned, the main thing that is exciting is quantum computing and what that can bring to CFD. Because we didn't really mention it earlier on too much, but the fact that CFD is basically done statically. So we do static leg positions, and that's because moving your leg within a simulation is really hard because all the STLs change. So you have to remesh, and then you have to resolve, and it's incredibly complex. Even if you have some mesh morphing, but mesh morphing around a moving leg is very significant. So it's a hard problem. Whereas rotating things like wheels and brake rotors, they're not too challenging. You just have rotating wall conditions basically, and a center of rotation, and the mesh itself stays the same, but it's just the wall that is different. So if we move or crack quantum computing, and it sounds like not necessarily it's on the horizon for next year, but in the near future, it's a potential thing, then the amount of the cost of computation becomes orders of magnitude cheaper. So then the complexity of CFD can, for the same cost, become order of magnitudes more complex. And then potentially things like that are feasible and potentially possible. So then you don't have the point that the spy raised of, well, if you want to do pedaling cycling in PIV, you have to go in a wind tunnel because of the whole reference frame problem. So then you can suddenly do that in CFD. And then that becomes an exciting thing to then go to a wind tunnel, do your PIV there, then get a correlation to a pedaling CFD, what we call a mannequin. It's a digital twin of the person that you've scanned. So yeah, I think it's the way I expect us to go in the future, but it is heavily reliant on computational power becoming orders of magnitude cheaper. Else it becomes a finance resource problem, really.
I'm sure you were the same when you first heard quantum computing, and your mind went straight to CFD. It's like, what else would you use this for but CFD?
And probably time trial simulations. There's things you could do to make them a bit more complex and a bit more advanced. But yeah, step 1, CFD, step 2, simulations.
We've talked about correlations and all so much in this episode, but that's maybe the one point that I don't recall us having mentioned is just like we run simulations and models, and you specifically more so than me, but I use best bikes. But ultimately that's what you're kind of hoping to do here as well. It's just like make those models so much more accurate, so much more useful, so much more valuable. I remember standing in Barcelona a couple of years ago asking you, like, do you do anything on correlations here? Because you were working on team time trial with Ineos at the time. And your answer was yes. that was it. But presumably that's one of the opportunities that this brings into the future also.
Yes, definitely on the team time trial side. And that's obviously a really exciting aspect.
You're going to
not that we're going to... But it's one that's not well understood because it's really hard to study. Like to do a team time trial aerodynamic study, which has been done. There are people who've done them. I mean, I did quite a big one for the sub-7, sub-8 Ironman project back in, what year was that? 2022. It was, yeah, 2022. Wow, 3 years. That's flown. So with that, we had the Decker Ring, which is 5.7K, basically a big velodrome, pan flat, banked ends. We did a 10-man team time trial with 1-man laps at, it's about threshold. So it was like 53K an hour, something like that across the guys. And then you can get everyone's CDA in every position, so you can figure out how well you draft, which is a really powerful study. It's been really helpful for my modeling of team time trials. And we had lots of different size riders, and you could start to infer the relationships between drafting behind different people because that was really clear from the order. But you've got 10 guys and you want to try them in lots of different orders, then obviously the problem size grows massively, and we didn't have weeks and weeks to continually run these studies. So if you can get your confidence, especially in your wake, then you can start to run CFD on team time trials in a much more realistic and confident way, because that is exactly what's happening in a team time trial. You are drafting in the wake of the rider ahead. So if you're not modeling that wake very well, and you're not modeling Hansgrohe transition and turbulent effects, then your model is pretty junk, I would say. Give you a direction, but not the whole load of confidence.
Especially when you're talking about the Tour TT next year, where it's that one rider across the line for their GC time. I mean, the potential that you could be aiming for is how do you deliver them in the freshest state possible to go crazy in that last K, 2K? So that'll be a cracking tool for that.
Yeah, maybe like a Red Bull Advanced Technologies time trial simulation tool could be really useful. It genuinely will be, really, and we're doing a lot in that area. And yeah, tying it into team time trials. I mean, arguably Catesby is another great environment for doing a team time trial. It's slight descent, so you're 0.46% gradient downhill on the way out, and then obviously uphill on the way back, but everything else is consistent and pristine. And you've got 2.7K, so you can comfortably get up to team time trial speeds and do those studies in a very, very controlled way. So being another one to do that correlation. Now, how do you do PIV on an 8-man team time trial with repeats and constant positions? I don't have any idea. Without crashing, yes, let's not mention that word. I've already had a few near misses, not least in team time trials. But anyway, there's only a few tunnels that you can do team time trial setups in. Specialized in Morgan Hill's one of them. You can have 2 riders ahead, I think, and that's about it. Most of the tunnels don't have a large enough either test area or platform extension to enable you to do it.
All right, well, yeah, as we already mentioned, Dan, you have a few other meetings to get to. Spy here also has a day job to get back to, as do I. So I think that maybe the best place to wrap it up is we've always said you can't see aero. Is that now changing, Dan? Can you now see aero?
Just about.
Well, that's better than we ever had before. So I feel like congratulations is in order here for what you've done so far. So fair play. Looking forward to if or what comes out of it in the future. And thank you for joining us today for breaking it down. And thank you also, Spy, for joining and getting into those hard-hitting questions straight away. You definitely scuppered my plan a wee bit. You threw me off track there, but you straight on with the good questions.